So it was 7A. Says moved by Commissioner Hernandez. And then on page 4, it was 7D. Also says it's the same thing, but then he's listed as absent, so
Okay.
I wasn't sure how important it is or how
Yeah,
that's reflected.
we'll just we'll look at the record to make the changes.
Okay,
We saw those, thank you for pointing that out. We'll make those changes.
thank you.
Commissioner Hernandez, do you have any, I know you weren't here last week. You may not have any issues with it.
Yeah, I'm just going to abstain since I was absent.
If we can have motions.
Jimenez,
sorry.
motion?
Yeah. Second, Commissioner Hammond, with the, obviously with the changes
Thank you.
that I do. Mhm.
Commissioner Hernandez,
Abstain?
Commissioner Jimenez,
Yes?
Vice Chair Hammond,
Yes.
Chair Shively.
Yes.
The vote of 3 yes and 1 abstention, this motion passes.
Item 8 is a business item. Item 8A is a workshop number 2 for the 2021 through the 2029 housing element update. It's a safety element update and new environmental justice element. Workshop to discuss and solicit information from pertinent to the housing element update, safety element update, and new environmental justice element.
Mr. Chair, if I may, before we proceed on item 8A, I just wanted to clarify for the record that item 7, there are no public hearings, and that we're just moving on to item 8.
That is correct, sir.
Okay, and our consultant is available by Zoom to make the presentation, and I will let Sarah introduce this item.
All right. Good evening. Can you guys hear me okay?
We can.
Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. All right. Well, thank you for having me. Good evening. My name is Sarah Walker, and I'm a senior project manager with National Community Renaissance. And thank you for having us back tonight. We're here as a follow-up to the first workshop that we held back in February. Cynthia, if you could advance the slides. And so tonight I have 2 of my colleagues with me, Erin Fanensteel and Monica Guerrera, and we will be providing you with an update on where we're at with the housing element update, the safety element update, as well as the creation of the new environmental justice element. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right into the housing element update. And as you may recall, just a brief overview from our February meeting, the housing element is one of the 7 elements of a city's general plan. It's a policy document that is designed to evaluate housing needs and programs that are intended to guide the city's actions related to housing. And it is the only element that is required to be updated every 8 years and certified by the state. And so we are updating the city's housing element that was last certified in 2013. And this will be for the planning period from 2021 to 2029. Next slide. So tonight I'm going to actually be kind of diving into a little bit more detail on 2 specific sections. So we're going to be looking at the housing plan as well as the housing resources section, which does address the housing sites. So I wanted to just go ahead and give you guys an overview of the housing element goals for the next planning cycle. So these goals are supported by specific policies as well as program activities that are aimed at achieving implementation of the overall goal. So the first goal that the city has put forth is to promote and maintain a variety of housing types for all economic segments of the city. And this goal is centered around the belief that a variety of housing types are needed in order to house the different types of residents that live in Perris. And so a few of the programs that are currently in place in order to further this goal are the Senior Housing Overlay, which is in the zoning code, which is designed to encourage mixed-use housing for seniors specifically. We also have programs that are seeking to leverage funding sources to support the development of housing through public improvements and leveraging potential funding in the region. For example, if WRCOG were to set up a regional housing trust fund along those lines. And then also partnerships with organizations like Habitat for Humanity, who are intending to expand housing opportunities for kind of first-time home buyers. Next slide. So the second goal is to provide equal housing opportunities and to affirmatively further fair housing for all residents, including those with special needs. And in order to implement this goal, we have a few programs. I'm not also identifying all of the programs. I'm just kind of highlighting a few of the ones that we thought were most important or most relevant. So we have in the housing plan, the programs to support this goal include rental assistance to assist veterans, disabled, elderly, senior, and low-income families. And this is an existing program that is supported by home funds. The city also provides homelessness assistance in partnership with the Social Work Action Group, or SWAG, providing outreach and case management to unhoused individuals. And then the city has also reasonable accommodation procedures and provides funding for services and workshops through the Fair Housing Council of Riverside County. The third goal is focused on removing or mitigating constraints to the development of housing, as well as maintenance and improvement. And so this includes, when feasible, reviewing and revising development standards in order to facilitate the development of all types of housing. So, for example, some of the programs that are included under this goal include expediting or prioritizing proposed affordable housing developments through streamlined processing, looking at compliance with SB 35 to reduce the amount of scrutiny and time housing development spend and entitlements, and also amending the density bonus and second unit ordinances to make sure that they are compliant with state law. Goal number 4 seeks to provide increased opportunities for home ownership in the city. So a few programs that are under this goal include leveraged funding sources that are available through the city as well as the county to provide financial assistance and education about home buying, as well as, again, partnering with Habitat for Humanity in the development of single-family homes for workforce or moderate and lower income households. And our fifth goal is focused on enhancing the quality of existing neighborhoods through maintenance and preservation while minimizing displacement impacts. And so a few programs that I wanted to highlight under this goal include funding for continued code enforcement activity and partnering with local nonprofits to identify substandard dwellings and to offer property owners assistance through city and county rehabilitation programs. Also promoting the city's neighborhood preservation program and senior home repair program, and also requiring new development to be energy efficient, comply with the Cal Green Building Code, and encouraging existing property owners to consider upgrades, including things like solar panels. So that wraps up the 5 goals that we've identified in the housing plan. The other section that I know has been of interest is the housing resources section. So this also includes the inventory of resources that are available to show how the city is going to meet its regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA. And as a quick review, for the 2021 to 2029 planning period, Perris was allocated 7,805 housing units for 4 income categories. This includes 2,030 units for very low income, 1,127 for low income, 1,274 for moderate income, and 3,374 for above moderate income. Next slide. Thanks. So in order to understand what I mean, I wanted to dive in a little bit more and kind of give a little bit more information about what these different income categories equate to. So I've provided this slide that has information about kind of the annual income range that a extremely low, a very low, a low, a moderate, and above moderate family might be making. This is based on a household size of 4. And I also have provided some sample occupations that tend to fall into these income categories. So you can see that, you know, at the extremely low income level, we're talking about people that may work, they may be a fast food cook or a home care aide, even hairdressers. For moderate income, we're talking about individuals or households who may have a firefighter or a teacher that work in those industries. Next slide. So as we started to dive into the site's process, we have to actually identify specific areas of the city that we're going to accommodate the city's RHNA. And this is done through predominantly zoning and ensuring that the city has enough land zoned appropriately to accommodate particularly their lower income RHNA. And that default density is 30 dwelling units per acre. And so what we started with is we started by looking at the number of constraints that are actually within the city. And so what you have in front of you is a map showing the various land use constraints that exist. So you have airport hazard zones that are around the Perris Valley Airport, as well as the March Air Force Reserve Base. And these are important to note because they do limit or restrict density in some places to as low as 3 dwelling units per acre, and in some cases don't allow residential development at all. There are also significant portions of the city that are in flood or high fire areas. There are also portions that are subject to landslides. The city also has areas that fall within the Riverside County multi-species habitat conservation area, which also limit residential development. So as you're probably looking at the slide, you can see that it is actually, while the city has a fair amount of vacant land, there's a reason that this land is vacant and that there are many constraints that would prevent the development of high density uses. So it does create a little bit of a challenge in identifying suitable sites, particularly for high density housing. Next slide, please. So in evaluating areas in the city that have less constraints, you can see that those white areas are really around the downtown area, which aligns nicely with the downtown specific plan, but it is the area with the least constraints in the city that probably is most appropriate to accommodate higher density development. So we're trying to balance the fact that there are a number of constraints in the city, as well as the fact that we cannot concentrate all residential development or all affordable housing development in one section of the city. So we have to look at other factors, such as where the high resource or opportunity areas are in the city, and balance that with the constraints or the limitations that are there with the land use, with the land uses. And so we are predominantly looking at the downtown at this point, but also looking for other opportunities that maybe have less constraints. With the sites, what we are looking at is kind of sites with a few key characteristics, and that includes sites that are vacant, sites that are residentially zoned, particularly those for higher density residential uses or mixed use. And then kind of the third characteristic is sites that may be underutilized and ready to redevelop. Next slide. So in talking about planning for affordable housing, I did want to give some examples of developments at different densities in order to show how design can play a significant role in ensuring that housing does blend into existing neighborhoods. I wanted to share a few developments that kind of exemplify the range in density. So the top development is an example of a 66-unit senior housing development in Buena Park. It was developed at 37.5 dwelling units per acre, and it has 9 one-story casitas and an L-shaped building that it's actually 2 stories, and then it steps up to 3 stories in the interior of the site. The bottom example is a 78-unit development for families. It's also 100% affordable. It's on half an acre in East Los Angeles, which I realize is quite different than Perris, but it shows an example of how this is actually 156 dwelling units per acre. But because of the design, it's 3 and 4 stories. And it has quite a bit of building articulation and massing that's intended to be pedestrian oriented. And so just 2 more, the top development is in Santa Ana. It's an affordable development for families with 93 units on 1.74 acres. So that's 53 dwelling units an acre. And you can see the front of the building is more dense along the major corridor where there's transit, but the sides are 2 and 3 stories in order to complement the existing single family homes that are in the surrounding area. And the final one is Mountain View in Lake Forest. And it is a affordable development for families, and it is at 36 dwelling units per acre, and similarly it's 3 stories, and trying to blend into the existing neighborhood, which has a lot of single family in it. So I share these examples because I think that the city is going to have to, it's going to take a little bit to identify the sites. We're not tonight going to present any specific sites, but rather kind of, explain the strategies that we are focusing on in order to identify those sites. And so we will, during the discussion, we're happy to take your comments and discuss this further. I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Aaron Bannensteel with Atlas Planning, who's going to give you an update on the safety element.
Thank you, Sarah, and greetings, commissioners. Next slide, please. So tonight I'll just very quickly go over what is changing with the safety element. So the housing element update now triggers an update to the safety element. This is something that in the legislature's infinite wisdom decided to codify under Senate Bill 1035. And with that, it then triggers a whole host of additional requirements, some of which have been put in place over the last 7 years now that I'm doing the math right. So we'll talk quickly over these 3 specific components. Those are the ones where you'll see the greatest amount of change in the safety element, and then get into the discussion. Next slide, please. Oh, apparently we have arrows. My apologies. But just as an overview, really your safety element is focused on what are the key ways that you want to protect your community from unreasonable risks associated with the variety of topics that are in the government code section 65302G. But for the most part, the issues that we've identified that are of concern for the city of Perris is really focused on ground shaking, flooding, dam failure, liquefaction, wildland urban fires, and then slope instability. And then at the very bottom, these are critical issues that are not hazard specific, but more locational specific. And so most jurisdictions nowadays are having to address any issues associated with the proximity to military installations, peak load water supply requirements, minimum road widths and clearances around structures, and evacuation routes. And we'll go to the next slide. So in looking at what's now required under Senate Bill 1241, this is focused on wildfire hazards. We're looking to help you to create a community resilient to fire threats through investments in mitigation and resilience. That's the new goal that we're developing. And what we have to do as far as policies and actions to address wildfire hazards is really focus on things like vegetation management and brush clearance, the adherence to fire safe regulation requirements. We'll be looking at what are some of the historic fires that may have occurred in the city or within the vicinity. And then key things that CAL FIRE is looking for is what's going to, what is the policy, where are the policies and actions surrounding long-term maintenance and operations and provision of adequate infrastructure, specifically water supply. This is for fire flow requirements and ensuring that there's adequate water. And as you can see with a map, because the city has what are called very high fire hazard severity zones, your element triggers review by CAL FIRE to meet SB 1241 requirements. And then ultimately the element will go up to the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection for adoption and provision of recommendations on any additional amendments to the element prior to City Council adoption. So it's a new layer of review that was put in place back in 2014. And because, again, of the presence of very high fire hazard severity zones, this is something that we'll have to address with this element update. Next slide. So the next requirement is focused on climate adaptation. This is under Senate Bill 379. And what you can see on the table is out of the Resilient IE project that was completed last year by WRCOG, there are a number of concerns with regard to hazards that may be exacerbated with climate change, as well as potential groups that may be vulnerable. If you could just click the button one more time, I'll expand on what those would be. So really the key hazards of concern with regard to climate change are going to focus on wildfire, extreme heat, and flooding, because these are already prevalent within the community, and it's anticipated that they will be impacted and impact residents, businesses negatively in the future. And where those impacts will be felt and the vulnerabilities are really focused on households that are living below the poverty line, persons that may be experiencing homelessness. They are definitely considered vulnerable when it comes to climate change exacerbated hazards, and then any chronically ill individuals. And a lot of things that we'll be addressing here are really going to focus on the climate change component of this, but it's really going to tie in with what I believe Monica is going to discuss as she provides an overview of the environmental justice element. Next slide. And then finally, evacuation is a major concern. This is the latest update to the requirements for safety elements. With the Resilient IE project that was completed last year, again, a series of maps were prepared for each of the WRCOG jurisdictions to really help communities understand and start to address these particular concerns. And so the new goal that has been developed is to create a community designed to effectively respond to emergencies and ensure the safety of residents and businesses. And these policy and actions that we'll be developing really focus on how can we enhance existing evacuation routes, requiring that new development is providing adequate ingress, egress, and then reducing or eliminating evacuation constraints and challenges. So whether or not you've got roadways that are undersized or you're missing linkages. And then one of the key elements that we've already completed as part of the process is starting to identify single access neighborhoods. And the definition that is being used, and it's an informal definition as of right now, as we're still waiting for guidance from CAL FIRE, is any existing residential neighborhoods where you have 30 dwelling units or more. What we have found is that there are 2 locations within the city. However, that's actually a very good thing in comparison to some of the other jurisdictions we're working in, which have significantly higher numbers of these types of locations. And with that, I believe that is my last slide, and I'll be passing it off to Monica.
Thank you, Aaron. So good evening. I'll be providing a brief overview of the work to date on the environmental justice element, briefly going over key issues that we've started to identify, the process of community engagement, and short review of next steps. Next slide. The city's update to 2 general plan elements directly triggers a state requirement to create an environmental justice element. Through SB 1000, which was passed in 2016, jurisdictions in California with designated disadvantaged communities are now required to incorporate environmental justice policies into their general plans. This can be done as a standalone element or throughout a comprehensive update of the general plan. For the city of Perris, we're developing a standalone element. Next slide. So there are 3 important pieces of an environmental justice element. Number 1 is identifying issues that impact the community. These include pollution exposures, food access, public facilities, housing, physical activity. The second piece is engaging the community both early on and throughout the entire process. And the third piece is identifying policies and objectives that prioritize improvements and programs that specifically address the needs of disadvantaged communities. Next slide. So to better understand the conditions within the Perris communities, we began with outreach and engagement. While the pandemic has limited opportunities for in-person engagement, there have been extensive efforts to reach out to diverse members of the community virtually. These events have served the purpose of informing community members about updates to the general plan, in addition to gaining insights into key issues and opportunities. To give you a sense of some of the stakeholders that we've met with, the school district, senior citizens, family care center, the Riverside County Office on Aging. And we also distributed a community survey online. And just for reference, about 81% of respondents to the community survey were residents in the city. Next slide. So to give you a sense of the types of issues that may be included and that we've started noticing in Perris, based again on community engagement and some of the data findings, are air quality and pollution from freeways, warehouses, and truck traffic. A lot of concerns with dumping of trash on lots, but also on roads and drainage canals in the city. And a lot of concerns with street safety and access to housing. This includes a lack of infrastructure for walking and cycling, but also things like sidewalks and lighting. Next slides. Okay. All right. So the state gives us some guidance on that second step for identifying disadvantaged communities. It gives us sort of three filters to use. The first is looking at census tracts within CalEnvirosScreen 3.0, which is a mapping tool, and looking at percentile scores in the top 25 sort of worst communities in this, across the state. Second is looking at low-income communities, using median income as a reference point. And third is identifying areas that may have cumulative disadvantages or health burdens, which may include environmental pollution, but also other hazards that can lead to negative health effects. And this last bullet is one that gives jurisdictions a little bit of flexibility in terms of how to define this standard based on local community context. Next slide. Thank you. So this is a map of disadvantaged communities in the city of Perris using data from the state. The numbers on the map refer to census tracts. Areas that are highlighted in red are census tracts that have been designated as disadvantaged. In Perris, some of the most prevalent pollution indicators that we notice across these census tracts include the presence of ozone, PM2, which are very small particles from vehicle tailpipes, tires, brakes, power plants, factories, even burning of wood, construction dust, diesel particulate matter, which we see coming from trucks, drinking water contaminants, and also hazardous waste and solid waste sites. These pollutants and their proximity to disadvantaged communities put residents at higher risk for potential negative health impacts. Next slide. So in Perris, disadvantaged communities are disproportionately impacted by the combination of both pollution and socioeconomic factors such as poverty. But there's also a bigger connection to socioeconomic factors like low educational attainment, high incidence of cardiovascular disease. We see high housing cost burden, language barriers, and also in some instances, high levels of unemployment. Next slide, please. Disadvantaged communities are also impacted by specific qualities of their built environment. So again, here are a few patterns that we've noticed in these communities. One, we see a higher rate of households that lack basic kitchen facilities and plumbing compared to the rest of Perris. We see higher rates of overcrowding. This means more than one person per room in a house. We see few areas with walking distance to a park, and we see high levels of car dependency to get to places, which also means less active commuting. Next slide. In sum, much of the data that we're finding out about disadvantaged communities in the city aligns with what we've heard from the community. The survey will close within the next week, and we're also in the process of drafting the environmental justice element. Once we've analyzed the results of the survey, we'll spend some time checking for any potential data gaps and identify whether there's a need for additional community engagement. That'll wrap it up for the environmental justice element. Thank you for your time, and I'll turn it back to Sarah.
Right, and I just wanted to conclude by kind of following up on the next steps. So as Monica mentioned, we still have this survey open and are still collecting input, particularly on for the housing element and the environmental justice element. We have substantial portions of all three elements drafted. So we're in that kind of draft element stage. We expect to have drafts ready sometime in the next month or so, and we will submit them up to the appropriate state agency for review. We will likely be back in front of you for adoption and certification in the fall. So with that, thank you again for having us, and we're here if you have any questions.
Yeah, I just want to note real quickly that this presentation will also be made during the Planning Commission, no planning, the City Council in June. Some of the documents that we don't have at this point, we're still working and making progress. One of the elements that's taking a little longer is just identifying sites that could accommodate high density housing. And one of that reason is that we're relying on a GIS consultant that's provided by WRCOG, Western Riverside Council of Government. And that resource is taking a little longer than we anticipated, and also the constraints that Sarah identified. But the purpose is just to gather feedback. We'll take this to the council in June. When those documents are available, we'll email those to you, and you can comment at the same time. Our whole goal is to be able to submit the draft housing element to HCD so we can get their concurrence, so that we can have everybody's feedback and making sure that we're on the right track. But just want to give you that quick progress and where we're at this point. And at this point, well, we'll take feedback from Sarah and her team, and we're here to provide additional support as needed.
Thank you. Commissioners, do you have any questions for Sarah and her team?
That may be a while. You may want to go.
No, go ahead, because I'm sure you're going to get mine.
She'll probably tip mine too.
Yeah,
No.
easier that way.
I'm on the right page here. Oh, okay. This is Vice Chairman Hammond, since we have to do this. Appreciate the report, Sarah. There's a lot of information here. And understanding the timetable, we've got this a lot to cover in a short period of time, believe me. There's a lot of stuff here, so I hope I can try to get through some of it, and I think my colleagues here will pick up on other ones. Let's go back to the economic income page where we talk about very low income, because that was my specialty in LA. Are we talking about, well, I'll let you find it. And low income and moderate incomes. I think it was a page, RH&A or something, and
Yeah.
I don't remember what page it was.
You want
Oh, am I seeing it?
yeah.
Okay. Oh, thanks. Regional housing needs. Okay, allocation. Question. Are we talking, when we talk about very low income, are we talking about the CDBG standard of HUD? Is that what the basis of that very low income is? That they base the number of units?
Yes, I believe they're using the state and federal income limits
Okay.
in order to distribute the units amongst the income categories.
Okay. Now, is this a statewide definition, or is this a Perris Riverside County definition in
No,
terms of?
it's a state.
of
It is
state?
a statewide definition.
Yeah, I can see, we're kind of all over the place here. 'Cause I would challenge some of these. Okay. I got several questions. I'm just going to start out, and I may think of some more later. We have now it's a new thing. I was on the original general plan, and we didn't have the environmental justice and the other things there. But one of the things I'm asking is the environmental justice element have to be separate and apart from the safety element, which is separate and apart from the housing element? In other words, these elements obviously are part of the general plan amendments, but when you do the safety element, does it just have to coincide with the environmental justice element? Or are they merged as one? How does that work?
Do you want me to
Yeah.
answer that, Sarah?
Yeah, anybody.
So, I mean, the housing element is typically standalone because
Right.
it is updated on its
Right.
own schedule.
Right.
The safety element is also typically a standalone element that addresses those. However, the EJ element can be done different ways. It can be incorporated into each element, and it can be a standalone. In this
Okay.
instance, we're kind of incorporating both the safety and the EJ element findings into the housing element. We're taking into consideration what those elements are kind of seeing, and for example, with affirmatively furthering for housing, as well as the constraints, the land use constraints that we're seeing, we're making sure that those are also consistent amongst the elements.
Okay, yeah. Because it takes a while to get a general plan, trust me. Let's look at I think we call them constraints. And it may be more of an engineering issue as well as a developer issue. When we're talking about these constraints of fire, constraints of flooding, of course, we went through the idea of emergency response. We went through all that with the Planning Commission. But these things can be mitigated. Obviously, because we make it sound like it's some jury thing. It's not. These things can be mitigated. We can't stop building based on that. I'm sorry. So if we have flood zones, we have ways of mitigating those things. I'm on the positive side of it. If we have these areas, which we do have, like for instance, by Lake Perris, obviously, if it bursts, there's nothing you're going to do to stop that. But we can mitigate these things. We don't really have an earthquake issue. We may have liquefaction, but those things are mitigated through each one of these designs. So when we did the general plan, obviously these things were covered at that time. Emergency response is added later, environmental justice is added later, but these things were covered. So it's not as though we're seeing this for the first time. So if we need building in these areas and fire areas need to be cleared, and we have to work with CAL FIRE and the county to clear our brush, we're just going to have to do it because we're under the gun to get 7,000, 8,000 units. The other thing is the environmental justice thing being separate and apart and somehow merged. If we're looking at a disadvantaged community, I would almost say that it's just the city of Perris, period. So if you have truck issues that you're breathing, it's not just for disadvantaged community. It's not like we're all segmented communities. All these things are going to be experienced by everyone. I don't know that we could say that north of Ramona Expressway is truck traffic. You're still going to have truck traffic. You're going to have freeway traffic. It doesn't matter if you're in the low income, middle income. So I'm not all that much for the environmental justice part. That's more like a social thing that we used to in housing, where we say disadvantaged communities, like Handy Workers program in LA, where you take seniors and you go and you repair their faucets, you put in handicap ramps, the disabled person ramps and bathrooms. Those are mitigating measures to improve communities, but it wasn't so much to get housing. Okay, so those were separate and apart, and that's why I was asking that question. Disadvantaged communities, obviously, we all live here, so we know there's overcrowding, there's lack of park facilities. Those things can be incorporated in some of these building things, so they could be mitigated. I think it's just really looking at what can we do in terms of, I think, and I'll give you my list, I think the density unit, as you mentioned, is one of the number one priorities. You're going to have to increase density. Finding areas that are going to be adaptable to transportation, and those transportation facilities like D Street, things of that. So close to the transportation corridors, shops, restaurants, not having to get in the car. I do a lot of that. But if you can increase the density units in some areas, I think that will enhance a lot more areas. I think the lack of apartments, and I'm not even talking about condominiums and townhomes, the lack of apartments is one of the reasons why you have the disadvantage. If you're solely requiring having all these single residential properties, guess what? You're going to have to do the lawn, you have to pay the property taxes, you have to pay all these other things that go with it. You're never going to have poverty erased if you do that. So you're going to have to, like it or not, have multifamily housing being a priority. So density may go up to 52 units an acre. It may be 60. I don't care. But if you want to get poor people out of stuff, you're going to have to give them at least the bottom level to get in so that they can move up and eventually have home ownership. Because Habitat for Humanity, which was like 1 or 2 houses that we were doing in Los Angeles, just was not existent in terms of the numbers of people that we had in poverty. So I think leveraging funds, since we lost the CRA funding, we lost those things, it's going to be up to WRCOG and the county and the other ones to start coming up with funding that's going to take the advantage away from not having fair market value housing or fair market value. If you're going to have low-income housing, you're going to have some incentives. I think these things tie for environmental justice, which is what I'm saying, Sarah, into your housing element. So if you want to do something about the environmental justice, you got to talk about the income levels in the city. You got to talk about the what's available now, which is virtually nothing. We have projects in design that haven't been built, so basically you have zero available. So if you're relying on residential property, and I'm talking as a housing person from several years, if you're only talking residential housing with 10,000, 6,000 square feet, it's never going to be resolved. I don't care what you vote on tonight. You're going to have to incorporate multifamily housing in areas where it can be density, but also understand that those areas that are not within that 2 to 5 mile radius, you're going to have to find a way to get them back and forth. That means transportation issues like RTA out here. It's going to mean how do you do that? So all these things impact your environmental justice. They impact the type of housing you have in the city. A lot of residential single-family housing. I don't have to tell these commissioners that. You're seeing a lot of residential at $400,000 up. No, poor people are not going to afford that. Okay, so what do? And you put the house on sale, it's gone the next day, right? 2 days later. So what do you do to mitigate that? You have to, and I think it's perfectly designed what you talked about, increasing density. It's not nice to some people, but I think it's inevitable. Finding the locations and areas is going to be the key. And I think that's how you do that. Lastly, I'm just going through a list real quick. Civic engagement is important. I see, and I think Elizabeth is going to hit this one, Val Verde School District. Well, I don't see Perris Union High School, Perris Elementary School District. I don't see any of the other ones. At least we know we can't get to a lot of people, but you cannot have Perris Union High School and Perris Elementary. How are they not involved? Val Verde? Okay, nothing personal. But, you got like 5 school districts within this region, and I don't know how we can not have those because that's where the parents are with the students. So Perris Union High, Perris Elementary School District, and I'm sure there's probably nosy whatever other ones nearby. But and that's not a criticism, I'm just saying I only saw Val Verde, and they're not really the total representation of all of our students in this area. And I'm just giving ideas. I'm not criticizing, I'm just giving ideas right now. I'll probably think of some more things, but I think you've done a good job identifying the fire zone, the fire areas, the need to identify CAL FIRE. But I think a lot of stuff can be mitigated through building design, clearing a brush. So I'm not going to be negative and say we can't build because that's there. We've been able to build all these projects. We've been able to put up all these houses. We put houses right across from Lake Perris, And it's not saying we can't mitigate. We can mitigate these things to get this done. The airport is one I've always been talking about for 19 years. That is an issue you can't do anything about. But outside those areas and those areas where you can build, it's just turning the compass from balancing residential property and single family into more multifamily. If we're going to reach the 8,000 unit, I'm saying 8,000 unit level, I don't see any other way to do it unless you start having increasing density and giving density bonuses. So I'll just start off with that that concept. And I think the key issues that were addressed by the community are pretty much going to get from us up here. Parks, truck pollution, air quality. You could have just asked the commission, really. Infrastructure, streets, potholes, things like that. We would literally say the same thing. So it just goes to show you live in a community, you know exactly what they're going to think. So I think you've done a good job. I think the issue and the focus has got to be how do we deal with the disadvantage? How do we deal with environmental justice, but tying into the types of housing? And the city's policies for residential may have R10,000 may have to be re-looked at, because that realistic, if you have a center core downtown specific plan, which I was involved with, downtown specific plan that has certain designated areas, we're going to have to start looking at higher density levels. I don't really see any other answer. And leveraging those funds in order for those people to build, because almost every developer wants fair market. I haven't found one yet, LA, Orange, I have not found one yet that wants to build low income without some support from the state or federal. They're just not going to do it because it's a money loss. Or you got to build 3,000 units where you would have been 500, you got to build 3,000 to just balance. So, if you want to build 3,000 instead of 500, they got to get a balance sheet. So that's always a reality with these people. It's not a matter of I can build low income, but I'm going to lose money. So you've got to help me if I'm going to have Section 8, or you got to help me if I'm going to deal with vets. Wonderful idea, concept. You're taking 30% of the building out. You're going to have a lot of building. So these are some things I'm proposing. I make it easy for you, don't I? But these are things that I'm looking at. I'm sure my colleagues will have more things, and I'm going to be quiet. But I just kind of lay the foundation out there for some of the thinking. And the housing element, since it's once every 8 years, I'm really going to pay attention to this one. Because, 8 years from now, things will change again next year. So that's what I'm looking at, and I'll pass it on to my others.
Commissioner Hernandez? Commissioner Hernandez, you got questions for Sarah and her group?
No, nothing on my end.
Thank you. Commissioner Jimenez?
Quick question. Were the numbers on the economic impact updated? Because I wrote down the numbers from our last meeting, and there was, I want to see 70 houses more. I had 77, 86 houses during that time. And I know we talked about that. Were they updated since then? For the low income, the one that Commissioner Vice Chair Hammond was talking about, where you talked about the very low households, low, moderate.
Yeah, the numbers were finalized. There were some cities that were going through the appeals process, and so we did update the presentation as well as the housing element document with the final adopted RENA numbers for the city. I think they did go up slightly.
Okay, yeah, they did go up
everywhere, all cities went up slightly.
Okay, and one thing that I did want to bring up is there a number on the minimum or maximum density that we need to have in order to meet the law?
Yes, so for the lower income, for the sites inventory, it has to be a minimum 30 dwelling units per acre. And what we're seeing is, and again, I think Commissioner Hammond is correct, that just because there's a constraint does not mean that that land is not, can't be developed. And so we're thinking about that, but certainly there are some areas like the airports that we just, because of the safety areas, we just can't build there, or, there's an overriding consideration. So I think the thing that we're thinking about is these constraints do add cost, and for affordable housing developers, that does become an issue, and it can become a constraint to the development itself. Market rate, no, probably not. I mean, if the market's there for it, then it will get built as a market rate home or, apartment. But yeah, I think.
One of the main reasons I ask is because I feel like if we don't approach this very strategically, we're going to be in a cycle, because I was at Walmart on Tuesday and I was in line for 40 minutes. So, and we're not even at the density that we should be at right now. And it's happened at several stores within the city where more people are moving in. Those lines are getting longer. So I'm happy Aldi's coming in. So I feel like if we just increase the density, and that's the only area we're targeting, we're also not hitting the parks, we're not hitting the stores, we're not hitting restaurants, we're not hitting the services, which would continually impact our other end, where these are the factors for low income, and we're just feeding into it. We're building houses and we're not supporting them. So we're kind of just without wanting to, kind of feeding into the same problem and making it worse instead of finding solutions. So I feel like it's something that we need to approach from all angles and not just we need to hit the housing density, but what is coming along with that. Like Vice Chair said, the issues with the pollution and even the water quality. Do you see where a lot of our schools are in that area? And I know our district has started to put in water filtration systems, but they shouldn't have to do that. We should just expect good water quality for our students. I also noticed that Val Verde District was also mislabeled on the screen. It was Vista Verde, which is a school. So it caught me off guard. I was like, wait, did I miss one of the districts?
I apologize about that. And I did want to let you guys know that Michelle Bawa actually did an e-introduction to all of the school districts for us. And Val Verde was the only one that was willing to meet with us. And we did go ahead and sent all of the districts a follow-up email with the flyer and information about the survey. So they did receive that information. We asked if they could distribute it to their school populations, but Val Verde was listed because they were the only ones that were willing to actually have it. They gave us an hour of their time to actually talk through things with us.
I'm not surprised. It's an amazing school district. But that, and I also wanted to know, so the districts that volunteer were the ones that were in charge of sending out the survey, or what other ways were we using to get the survey out to families?
And I don't know, Michelle, if you want to follow up on some of the things. We were trying to partner with the public health department to get it put up at City Hall in different locations, like when people were waiting to get their vaccine, as well as the water, where you pay your water bills. The school districts were kind of the main way with the families. We had talked to, I think, someone in Parks and Rec as well about providing information through some of their online platforms and classes. I don't know if Michelle wants to chime in on any others that actually, or correct me if some of them didn't occur, but those were ways that we talked about.
No, those all occurred. And then we also did send it out to, we have under our housing assistance programs, we have contacts with the different affordable housing developments, the multifamily developments. We sent them to those contacts as well. So they were blasted to our kind of general running list of community engagement organizations, the Family Resource Center. We sent it to County Fair Housing as well. It would only apply to Perris city limits, but we let them know that, and they have a strong network in Perris as well. I believe Perris Union also did. We did eventually. They didn't respond to the request for the meeting, but they did eventually. We made contact with their community engagement specialist, and they did send the survey out. The Chamber of Commerce is somewhere that we were able to get a presentation at one of their perk-ups. We also announced it and directed people during a Rotary meeting to direct them to social media where the surveys were posted. So we kind of, I guess, through COVID, we kind of had a list of a running master email list that we continually send out. Updates, event announcements, things like that. And we use that list to send the survey out as well. And then, like Sarah mentioned, we tapped into other departments' lists as well, including community services and public health.
I'm wondering, because I didn't get a survey, did one of you gentlemen get a survey?
Nope.
Vice Chair Hammond? Okay, I haven't seen a survey and
You may have seen a link or it was on a post. The link, the survey itself wasn't circulated. It was a link to the survey where you could click on it and be directed to fill out the survey. We also did, I believe, post it next to a recording of the initial Planning Commission workshop on the planning webpage. We weren't sure how high the traffic is on that page, but
is there a way to access it, or was there a way to promote it now for people that are at home or listening or still want to fill it out? Because it's still open. I think it's a great opportunity for us to try to get it out there. I mean, we all have social media where we can put it on too. Where would we find the survey?
I can send it to you directly if
Oh,
you'd
of course.
like. It is also available. We post pretty frequently because during COVID, that was kind
Right.
of the main way to get out there. So we did schedule it for periodic posts for the same post to appear here and there over
Okay.
time. But I'd be happy to send it, or I can send it to Ryan if you'd like, and he can send it to the full commission.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. And it's open until 2 more weeks? Was it 2 more weeks?
Yeah, I believe that we extended the date. Monica, do we extend it to the 15th?
Next Friday, so the 14th.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
Yep, thank you. If we could get that survey, I would really appreciate it.
Sure, no problem.
And those were just my main issues, mostly that, but just developing strategically so that we really are not making the conditions worse, so that next time we meet in 2020, whatever, 2030, we're not saying, there's less access to stores, there's less access to this, there's more pollution. And I think pollution might cap out. I think we need to find a way to really lessen it in our area. I think there's very few areas to build more warehouses, which I know is one of the main sources for the majority of the pollution that we find in our city. But once we cap out at, building warehouses, I think that's going to kind of level out. But if we start targeting it now, we really can get a handle on it and just make sure that our community's safe. I mean, we don't have parks, but if you're going to a park and you're surrounded by so much pollution, I don't know how healthy that is for you. So those are my comments and questions. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much. These maps are very beneficial, and I know that we are very constricted and confined from on the northern boundary of Perris with March Air Force Base landing zone up there. I didn't realize how restricted we are on the southern and southeastern part of Perris with the flooding zone, which is a lot more vast than I originally thought it was. And of course, the fire hazard zones, they pop up everywhere. But the map is very beneficial for us to understand the pockets that we can really work in to achieve our goals. One of the questions I do have is a little bit more of clarification. Is the peak water supply requirements, does that just have to do with fresh water supply, or does it have to do with floods or underground water supply basins? If you can go a little bit in more depth of what the water supply requirements are and what are our restraints that we currently have?
Absolutely. So the water supply requirements are really focused on whether or not you're able to meet fire flow demands. And so it's more about, are there adequate number of pipes in the ground, and do you have certain limitations to your system for the most part that prevent you from meeting the fire flow demands? And so majority of the time it's the identification of goals and policies focused on that all new developments required to meet fire flow requirements, and then any potential implementation actions or measures to address existing deficiencies. And so as of right now, I couldn't tell you if every square inch of the city is meeting the requirements, but it's mostly a combination of making sure there's adequate infrastructure in place so that fire flow is met for new development.
Thank you. A follow-up question is the adequate ingress and egress for individual properties. Are you suggesting any changes from our current standards that we may have? I'm sure, I imagine it's definitely for your fire trucks and emergency vehicles in and out of all the properties. Are you looking at investigating any changes to those, our current standards?
So the only thing you would be looking at is making sure you have the adequate provisions requiring more than one access point for subdivisions. So any new subdivisions, making sure that they have adequate numbers of roadway connections. Now, if you've got, a small parcel that is going to have 2 or 3 homes built on it, that's not going to trigger requiring you to build a whole new roadway network. It's more focused on what CAL FIRE is looking at is new subdivisions where you have a certain number of home sites and making sure that there are adequate connections into the circulation network. They just are trying to eliminate the potential that you have a whole lot of home sites that get cut off and are unable to evacuate because they only have one roadway in and out. This is less of a concern for communities like Perris versus communities, say, up in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where a lot of home sites have been built on very long, narrow, windy roads. So for the most part, you're already complying with the building code requirements and anything within the fire hazard severity zones needs to comply with the state fire safe regulations, which does require multiple points of ingress egress. So we're just really making sure that it's very clear that these now apply to the portions within the city that already apply to areas across the state.
Thank you. One final question for me is the issue of overcrowding our issues. Is there any pockets that we are concerned about in Perris that is overcrowded? And the question kind of is that we're trying to increase our density of housing. How does this going to affect overcrowding of some areas, and what are some of the issues that we can kind of balance those out, that it doesn't become a serious issue for us?
So I think that there's 2 things I would say to that. I mean, I think one is the idea would be if you're building more affordable housing in the city, you should be able, and I think Commissioner Hammond sort of was getting to this point earlier. The idea is that some of those folks would now have affordable housing that they could access, and some of them would move into those kinds of homes. I think in terms of specific areas of the city, we have a sense of 2 things. One is, give me 1 second. We have a sense of average household size. And so, Cynthia, can you put up the disadvantaged community map again?
Yeah.
Okay. So we know if we were to look at specific census tracts, we know, for instance, that in census tract 426.18, average household size is higher. It's 4.87. And again, these aren't perfect numbers, right? These are just averages. Compared to, for instance, census tract 428, which is 4.18 people per household. So that gives you a sense in terms of household size. And then we have a different number, and I'm trying to find that one, which is overcrowding. Give me a sec. Let me find, because I had so in census tract 428, we know that severe overcrowding, so that's 1.5 people per room instead of 1, it's at about 7.1%. Versus, for instance, census tract 426.20, where it's 1.4%. So there's a pretty dramatic shift in terms of overcrowding when you kind of compare those 2 census tracts. Again, 426.20 versus 428. And so I think another option is considering whether there are other ways in which you might be able to legalize or formalize other types of housing. So for instance, ADU units, like, is that a possibility in a census tract like 428 that might help mitigate, right, some of those overcrowding issues on one parcel?
Thank you very much for that clarification. I was looking at overcrowding as more of a residential unit per acre type scenario instead of by room or by residents, individuals per residence and individual per room. That was that's good information for me. I appreciate the answer. You guys have any further questions?
Oh, yeah.
for?
Either one, go for it.
I have one more for the evacuation plan. My question is, when we take that into consideration when looking at this, do we solely just use the city boundaries, or do we extend it a little bit? I'm thinking because the northwest, right across the street from the lake, that street, Ramona Expressway, is kind of leeway into a lot more cities. Like, a lot of people take that towards Hemet and things. So if anything were to happen to the dam, it wouldn't be just those houses. It would be a larger extended area that would be impacted. There's a lot of farms over there. So when we're looking at these evacuation plans, are we limiting it to just those boundaries and that's our cutoff? And, you know, the people up north have 2 streets they can exit from without really taking into account the surroundings. I know towards like 74 too. I mean, that connects so many places. And I'm looking, it's right smack in the middle of the city almost. So that's one of the egress points. So you would have kind of like a, a bottle, what is it called? You know what I'm calling it? Like a funnel type of thing where you have people coming from 2 points and meeting up at a center point. Bottleneck. That's what I'm trying to say.
I couldn't think of him.
So just to clarify, what this is versus what this isn't. The evacuation routes that we're identifying are just that. They're just the routes that could be used for evacuation purposes. It's not intended to go through a full-blown analysis of how you're effectively going to evacuate based on specific types of hazard scenarios. That's actually most appropriate for your emergency management department and as part of the emergency operations plan. You know, that's really what tells the city staff what to do in the case of an emergency, how, you know, where to go, things like that. So what this is doing is it's really setting the framework and the foundation for what ultimately needs to be done from an emergency management standpoint. So what we're looking at is what are the routes that should be used for evacuation purposes. And we do look at those routes and how they connect into the overall network. As part of the Resilient IE project that WRCOG did, the evacuation network that was established was actually for the entire region. And so we're looking at those regional routes that are migrating in and out of Perris and using that as the foundation. And then we'll look to what are some additional roadways that should be used or identified and expanded upon for use during evacuations as part of this element update.
And would you go a little bit more into detail about how those are determined? I heard you talking about 1 in, 1 out, or 2 access points. Is that also taking into consideration if we do increase the density? Does it take into account density? Does it take into account the type of roads? What is taken into account when we're looking at this?
So the routes that were established were based on the size of the roadways, you know, so obviously evacuation routes are going to be larger roadways that have multiple lanes and connect into connect throughout the region. And so whether or not the route is built out to its final width and alignment is immaterial as much as is it already connecting into other parts of the region to essentially move people from areas of harm into areas of safety. One of the things that we'll be able to do, though, is to identify some potential opportunities for new routes if they're necessary, and some policies to ensure that any roadways that are identified and used for evacuation purposes need to meet city standards, be built out adequately to accommodate not only daily demand, but also emergency response and evacuation needs. That's one of the policies that we like to incorporate into all safety elements based on the work that we've been doing over the last year or so with CAL FIRE, with these CAL FIRE reviews.
So when density increases, we would be
Roadways need to increase. Yeah.
Okay, so it is kind of related to the density and in each area.
Right, and one of the things that we'll do is we want to make sure that that city staff, the planning commission, city council, that you have the tools when a development is being proposed and the density is higher than what that road may have been designed for. You have the tools to be able to ask that those roadways need to be expanded, capacity needs to be provided, not only to meet the daily demand, but also the evacuation needs and concerns for the community.
Good. And is that something that would be able to be provided to us so we can see the evacuation and density or suggested so that when we are looking at plans, we have that information?
The policies will be in the element that you'll eventually review. As far as the actual standards, roadway requirements, things like that, that's really going to come out of your public works department, engineering department, and what the roadway standards that they are going to adhere to for new development based on density.
Perfect. Thank you.
Understand?
Yeah, thanks. We're getting detailed this time about that. I think, first of all, you guys did a great job. I know you're looking at this like, oh, all these questions, but we're kind of the first line of defense before it gets to the next level. One of the things, too, and I'm listening to her talk, when you talk about, number one, when you talk about crowded households, we're really talking about the actual households. If you look at any street in Paris, you have to live here to know this. You'll have 7 or 8 families in a house. And I know because I'm next to me. One of the reasons may be, and I'm speculating now, the mortgage payments are rather high. You have to pay utilities and all the other things. When you have a lack of other alternatives, I just made your argument to the state. When you have a lack of other alternatives, then you have to have this density level in-house, single-family residential, which impacts the streets, which impacts the flow, all that happens. That's what happens when you don't have multifamily housing. You force a lot of people in the house, you force a lot of cars on the street, and that's what happens when you don't. There's the end result. It's happened in Los Angeles. I think one of the things, too, this is for our engineer. It's okay. But ultimately for the city, when you increase density, and this is not necessarily a bad negative, but when you increase density, almost your point, the vehicle trips also are going to increase. So you're going to have an increase in vehicle trips. The idea, as we talked about several times, you got to get people out of cars. You're going to have transportation analysis to say that on the RTA, some other things are going to have to be available. That's why you have it impacted in an area so much more. The D Street, San Jacinto, over in that area by city, right across the street from us, literally. Those kind of areas start impacting. You're going to have those transportation analysis because that's what you sell to state. That other chart you showed had the the areas in red were the high density poverty, and you talk about environmental justice. You solve that by having low-income housing that's affordable and it's multifamily. The alternative is try to get a residential and 10 families in a house. That's a sad thing to put on somebody to have to do that, to pay a $2,500 mortgage or $3,000. That's why you have it, guys. I'm teaching you something. So when you don't have the alternative for higher density, which you must do, you're going to have residential properties where you have 10 families because you just can't afford it. I can barely afford mine. But that's what the alternative is, and that's the end result. The streets have to be looked at, every individual project. Where you talk about D Street, you've got to look at those things in terms of what is the realistic transportation needs in that area and what's viable. But that's why the downtown strategic plan becomes important. And those areas around that corridor that you circle are really going to be where it happens. But it's not just putting up apartments. It's going to have to be maybe some business offices. You're going to have to look at some creative designs. We saw some examples there. I'm not sure about the one in East LA, but we saw some examples there of 91 units, 76 units. You're going to be at that level. Sorry, you're going to be 5260. You're going to be at that level. If you want to have any impact of 78 to 8,000 units, where are you going to put these? So ultimately, it's kind of a balance. You don't want all apartments, but you also have to have townhomes, condos. You have to have step-up things, which I've talked about for all the years I've been on this. You can't just focus everything on poverty, but you can't focus everything on people who have money. So you have to have levels. Millennials want to start somewhere. Senior citizens go back, right? And so they get out of these houses and they want to go back to apartment buildings. Well, what's affordable in the city? We asked about income. We're not just asking that out of the clear blue sky. The income level to be able to afford market level apartments in Perris. If the Perris apartment, we don't know what the level is in Perris in terms of fair market. It's $1,200 a month, $1,500. If you're making $36,000 a year, and are you paying more than 30% of your income for rent? Those are the things you look at for a housing element. And the state, HCD, that's what they want to hear. If I'm paying 70% of my income for just paying rent, you're going to have a hard sell, guys. So you're going to have to start looking at what is the income level, what is the fair market value in this city, not Temecula, not Menifee. We're talking about in Perris. What is the average apartment rates going for? And then you look at the incomes and what is the 30% affordable? Because if you talk about Section 8, you're talking 30%. Okay, that person paying. Well, 30% of what? So that's one of those considerations that's part of this, should be part of this. When you talk about environmental justice and you talk about housing element, it's always what the cost is in Perris as it currently stands for average apartment. Okay, they should know that. It should pop out on one of these pages. In Perris, they're paying $1,200 a month on average for a 2-bedroom, $1,300 for a 3. I don't see that. I would do that if I was working in LA, but I'm not working there. So I would see things like that and say, what are these rates and what is the income and what income would it take to get to that? Now we're getting down to brass knuckles now. What is affordability? Okay, as we talked about with our engineer, if you talk about these development plans, you talk about 500 units. How much of that is going to be affordable? If we're talking about 800, how much of that is going to, what constitutes affordability? So you see the emphasis of the Planning Commission, affordability, what does that constitute in this city? Because when you talk about housing element and putting up apartments, are we talking $2,000 to start with? Well, my income is $25,000. So you gotta take that into consideration in any housing element in any city. Because some cities, we're not gonna worry about that in Temecula. But in Perris, what is your average income? If it's $78,000 for a household, just assuming, that's a whole household making $78,000. What proportion of that is for rent? Okay. When you look at CDBG stuff, which I did for 30 years, the CDBG and all CSBG, those things were consideration when you talk about funding these projects. If I'm going to put up a federally funded apartment building, how much of that's going to be paid for by the person? Is it 50%? You can't do that. It's be 30%. So that means the developer has to eat those costs. So if you don't have the funding from the state, if you don't have the leverage funding, which you talked about, which is good, we're going to have a very difficult time. I'm just being realistic. So I agree with everything that's said. I think the considerations can be mitigated. Summing it up, we can mitigate these areas of fire. We can mitigate the liquefaction. We can mitigate because they have houses planned for these areas. It's just a matter of the cost. What would be the cost for that citizen, that resident that's low income, disabled, and what is that income in relation to what the apartment costs are in the city now? And if we don't see that, it's going to be very difficult to make decisions about, well, this guy wants to come in and build, and he wants to charge market rate $2,500. That's not Perris, $2,500. Are you out of your mind? Okay, what's reasonable? But then what is the last thing I'm going to say? The city. You don't want the city of Perris to be one of those constraints. So as long as the city has constraints, rules and regulations that are way over the high cost per apartment unit. I know I'm stepping on toes. That's fine. Those kind of things that can be mitigated, that are not like DIF, we know what top do, that things have to be looked at. That's the third element, and I think they would agree on this panel. We got to get the constraints out from this place, because that's where the start is. Because if you have high costs for city costs just to build, developers, I want apartment buildings. When I get the single family development unit for $450,000, you want me to build apartments at $200,000 per unit? So you got to think that way when you're in housing. And that's an area I love to deal with. It's housing, because housing is important. the type of city is a blue-collar city. You have people working in warehouses, you have people working in distribution centers, you have contractors, plumbers, and all that, different wages, different levels, can afford things. But you always want to have a starting place, apartments, and levels, so where persons can have home ownership. Maybe condos, townhomes, which we don't see much of, moving up to those things. So seniors may want to go back to apartments. Millennials want to start in apartments, but eventually buy a home. So you want a balance in the city. And right now the balance is residential. Or 6,000, or 10,000, or that's where the houses are buying right now. You name me an apartment that's been built recently. That's market rate. You can't name one. They may be in a apartment, you can't name any. So what happens to your 18-year-olds? Okay. You don't have 18 to 25, 18 to 30. You can have a senior citizen city, which is fine. That's why they have Sun City down there, right? So hopefully it is a helpful comments. I think you guys do a great job. We're just giving insight as residents of this city. Not just planning commission, we're residents. And whatever you can take from it, whatever we can do probably to help, I think it's too bad we can't get the Perris Union High School and these people to come before us. But it would be nice to have their input because the school districts have the kids. The Perris Union Elementary, Perris Union, they have the kids. They have the parents. Now, they may be tired of being home right now and doing Zoom, but, I think you've done a great job getting the people that you have under the circumstances. We are talking COVID, not easy. And normally would we have these meetings, you just can't do it. So anyway, I said a lot more because it's a once every 8 year. So if you don't say it now, guys, you can wait 8 years from now. So you almost have to get it all out. And hopefully we've given you more than enough information that you could use. But thanks, a good job, Sarah, and all the staff. And I think the questions have been answered. I think some considerations, hopefully they'll be helpful. And the draft comes out, the council's going to have their statements and their sayings, but we're the first line, so we get to beat you up the most, right? And then the next level, we'll do whatever they're going to do, but we're kind of looked at as the ones that kind of vet things. So definitely been vetting it this evening, right? So I appreciate that and I appreciate to Kenneth too, that this has become an issue that's come before us. It's something I've talked about, but it's just the perfect timing. Houses are selling like crazy and there's no apartments. So that balance is going to have to be looked at. So with that, good luck.
Thank you. Sarah, thank you very much for your presentation and your staff as they work on it and continue to work on it until we are ready to submit it to the state. Thank you very much. So at this time, if anybody, any member of the public wishes to speak on item, they can do so at this time. Seeing none, we'll go ahead and close the public comment on this item and bring it to item 9, which is also public comment. Anyone who wishes to speak to the Planning Commission on any items not on the agenda may do so at this time. And we'll go ahead and close public comment for this time and bring it to commission members and announcements and reports. Commissioner Hernandez, do you have any announcements?
No announcements on my end.
Commissioner Jimenez?
I just want to say I drove by the Winco where they're building it, and it's coming along very nicely. I think it's going to be great to have it there. I happened, I made my comment earlier. I was at Walmart because I get my eyes checked there, and I thought it would be a quick run to just pick up a few, items for the house for groceries. And it really was over 40 minutes that I was in line, and it was just crazy. I saw a couple get out of line and leave, and I've had that experience at other stores, and I know because of COVID and all, they're still understaffed or they're trying to limit the amount of people in the store, but you're losing customers, and we want to keep money in our city. And when you're having to go somewhere else because of the lines and all, it kind of doesn't serve a purpose. But that Aldi's coming along very nicely. Everything is doing well. I'm glad to see I get the notices of how many new COVID cases and how many new deaths. And I'm happy to see that it has declined, and almost every day there are no new reported deaths, which is really, really good news.
Thank you. Commissioner Hammond?
Yeah, I don't want to prolong it. Like you, I go in that area quite a bit, and I think the Walmart plaza has really been maintained very well. And it's good to see some of the things that are coming on. I think they're building up the street for the Kentucky and Little Caesars or whatever that is. So there's constantly things going on. I should report that I had my second shot on Tuesday, so I'm done with that. It was only one day of pain, and I survived that one. I think the pain was just doing it to go there in the first place, and after that, it's like, oh, this is nothing. In looking at the city, and I agree, my issue still becomes the parkways and those areas, and we really got to know who's responsible. There's some businesses along Perris that are fantastic, industrial warehouses, they have the money. Some that are in the Stone Ages, and it's inconsistency, and it's just a matter of who is responsible for doing what. That is not a minor question, it's a major question. You talked about the survey that they took. What were some of the things they talked about, right? Streets, infrastructure, trash. See, all these things citizens see, they just don't come here. We're saying it. So one of the areas you see is those little parkways between the sidewalk, go down A Street all the way to was it Rotary Park? You got all this weeds and things happening, and who's responsible? Without answering that, it's going to, and the first thing when you come in the city, you come in from 4th Street, you see weeds. You come in from other areas, you see weeds. You don't want that to be your thing when you come into the city. You come off the Freeway 215, go on the Wayville Road. They've been cleaning it up a little bit on the median parkway, which is very good, but then you have weeds on the side. So it's kind of, it's inconsistent, and it's like if you put a house up and you have weeds that are 10 feet high, then this beautiful house, well, the first thing I would see is there's the weeds. So I think that, at least, not even so much just for us, it's just a clarification for residents, because it's kind of a mixed bag of who's responsible. And you do this in government all the time, because I did it for 35 years. Somebody else is responsible. Who is? Okay. So that needs to be answered, because you have future projects, and if they're going to have parkways, and you don't have HOAs, like on my side of town, there's no HOAs. Is it up to residents to do it? It's not going to happen. Is it up to Public Works going to do it? Good luck. Is it up to the developer? After 10 years, they say bye. So, some do, some don't. Your area, that area up there is a HOA. I mean, he can eat off the streets. That area over there with Barrett and Combs and that, oh gosh, the park. Then you go other areas, you're like, oh boy, So that's kind of a questionable issue. It's not so much a complaint, but that's a citywide issue, and I'm not sure how that gets resolved unless we start either educating people as to who's responsible. They can have a number to call, and it can be enforceable. But that's just one of those community issues that kind of permeates constantly over the years. And other than that, Perris has a lot of good things going, and I think I did eat at Sizzlers. It was 50% full weight at Sizzlers, and they were so happy to see people pay anything. And it was we almost had it to ourselves. But see, they're opening, and so they're happy, and the service is fantastic, very clean, everything else. So positive stuff is happening.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Hammond. I might suggest that maybe we can try to organize something for a quarterly street cleanup or sidewalk cleanup that could potentially happen. That would be maybe a good opportunity that we can try to encourage to do. But I don't have any further comments other than that. My second shot is on this coming Monday, so I hope I don't. I hope I have the same experience you did. So, that's all I have. So if we can go to item 11, Director.
Good evening, Chairman Shiley, members of the Planning Commission. Thank you for the feedback for the housing, safety, and environmental justice element. We'll make progress with those elements, and we'll send you those flyers to take those surveys. So it should be sent to you shortly. Just some updates, as you mentioned, the COVID cases are declining. I think we've been in the yellow or tier, we're not officially in the yellow tier, but you had to maintain 2% or less for 3 weeks straight. to get in the yellow tier. We're in the second week into that. So if we go into one more week, then there's less restrictive requirements for restaurants and like hairdressers to open up. So hopefully we'll be successful and people who are healthy take the COVID test, because if you're sick and you show up, everybody does that, then our numbers will be very high. But if this healthy and the sick people show up, then I think it would result in better, lower positivity rate for the city. Just another thing I wanted to bring to your attention is the Planning Commission application. The due date is May 14th, so if you haven't applied, please do so. So just get that in. I think it's 5 p.m. next Friday, so please take care of that. I thought I heard that there were 7 applicants already, and so if you're not one of them, it would be nice to add you to that list. So, okay. Other thing I want to just update you quickly on is we are seeing a lot of single-family home development. We've been speaking to, at least they've called us, D.R. Horn. They're in the process of trying to close escrow on 3 tracks along Evans between Orange and Nuevo. And that's about 350 homes or so. So the housing market, as everybody knows, is really strong, and we get a lot of interest calls about maps that have recorded in the past, and they're just kind of springing back up. So hopefully we'll see more development, and with that, there's just more of a desire for these commercial developers to come into the city because they really want to see progress on rooftops. And so I think we're slowly demonstrating that, and hopefully we'll have more retail outlets and retailers such as Audi and those businesses of those nature. So hopefully that will lead to more economic development in the city. On another note, just wanted to, just for your planning, we'll have another planning commission in 2 weeks. So we just put that in your calendar. It will be a scoping meeting for an industrial project. So I believe that's the 16th. And with that said, I don't have any further.
19.
19th. Thank you.
Today's 5th.
Yeah.
It's the 19th.
19th. And beyond that, I know that some of you didn't want to be here because of Cinco de Mayo.
Did I say that out loud?
But we can celebrate because we're concluding the meeting tonight. So.
You still have time.
I still have time.
Thank you. Item 12, adjournment.
Before you get to that, are you planning to schedule meetings in June, considering that you have the Planning Commission applications or whatever, which will happen in June, right? Before the council, that is.
We still do, because your term expires, or those who are expiring, expires on June 30th. And so if we have projects that are ready, we would still hold them. So, and then if there's, for some reason, if they're installing new commissioners, at least we'll probably install one new one at a minimum, just because we have one vacancy. So if that happens, we do have to have a meeting just to kind of, what's the terminology for it? Just to orient you.
Oh, okay, because that's interesting dynamic. Well, is it not? It's not scheduled for council until the 2nd. Well, it had to be the 2nd Tuesday, right? The 8th or something.
Yeah, I think right now it'll be the 2nd Tuesday in June is the schedule right now for the nomination. So it'll be June 8th.
Okay, so June 8th.
And so once the closing period, we'll go through all the applications, and then they'll contact you, and we'll probably have a.
Oh, not me.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, just can clear, because that overlap happens all the time, where you have a meeting and then all of a sudden the council meeting, well, I'm not on it. Well, Then you have a meeting at the end of the month, but people have no clue what they're doing. So that's one of those things where the timing is one of those things. That's the only reason I was asking. We're not sure whatever schedule will be in June, but you're planning to have a meeting in June. It would be the next day, right? Wouldn't it? The 9th.
Yeah, the 9th, I think.
Okay, that'd be interesting. Yeah, that's clarification.
Thank you.
Oh, no, June 2nd.
Yeah,
That's
second,
the first Wednesday, June 2nd.
first Tuesday. It's first.
I'll move a motion to adjourn. Hammond.